Welcome to the RealClear Politics Takeaway for Friday, October 1st. I'm Andrew Walworth. Well, it was a week packed with critical deadlines, which came and went. And as of this Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, which is when we're recording this, we still are waiting to see if Congress will vote on President Biden's infrastructure plan or whether the whole thing gets kicked down the road for another day. We'll talk about that, and we'll also look at a new poll from RealClear Opinion Research on American attitudes towards the military in the wake of the Afghan withdrawal. And we'll discuss the politics of Generation Z. Who are they? What do they believe? And how will COVID-19 shape their political views in the future? Joining me are Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RealClear Politics, Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief, and John Della Volpe, head of polling for RealClear Opinion Research, and author of a brand new book called Fight: How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. So, Tom, Nancy Pelosi said she wouldn't bring anything to the floor if she didn't have the votes. So far, she is a woman of her word. But bring us up to date. Where are we on this, and what happens next?
Well, whatever I say is probably going to be out of date within minutes. That's how fast things are sort of moving on Capitol Hill. It is obviously a struggle, a real struggle for Nancy Pelosi to try and get this infrastructure bill voted on and to get to some sort of consensus on the reconciliation bill, which still, is at $3.5 trillion, but I think most people agree it's not going to be that. So I don't know how this all works out. I mean, I still find it hard to believe they wouldn't pass at least the hard infrastructure bill, and where that leaves the reconciliation bill remains to be seen. But look, passing legislation, particularly big legislation, is hard. And we've talked about before, whenever a party has tried something like this, they've either had huge majorities in both chambers or they've had broad bipartisan support across. They do not have that for this, at least on the second piece of it. And the majorities that they have in the House are so slim, and in the Senate, literally nothing, that it is doubly, triply hard, I think, to try and get this thing over the finish line. And Pelosi and Biden have been working very hard to get there. They haven't been able to get there so far. They still may not get there in the end. I mean, I think there's still a chance that this thing, blows up. But the first deadline that was set on Monday for the vote, second deadline, they've blown past both of those, and because they just don't have the votes right now. And so that's where we are, and we'll see whether I owe Carl Cannon wine or not. Although there has been a wrinkle in this, because I had told Carl, if it gets voted down, that's it. He owes me wine. He said no. They have until the end of the year. They can come back with something, but I maintain if there's a vote taken and it fails,
wine ages well, Tom. It really doesn't matter.
This is the bet between Carl and Tom, a couple bottles of wine, on whether there will be an infrastructure vote or not, or whether it'll pass or not. Carl is on the affirmative. Tom is on the negative. Sanders tweeted out this morning, Senator Sanders, 2 senators cannot be allowed to defeat what 48 senators and 210 House members want. We must delay passing the infrastructure bill until we pass a strong reconciliation bill. That's this morning. So,
well, that's the latest stink bomb. But let's take a step back, because what I see this somewhat differently, and this is not a partisan point I'm about to make, because I felt the same way when John Boehner was Speaker of the House. So Boehner had these various bills, legislation, budgets that had popular support, and he couldn't get passed. Why couldn't they get passed? Because the Freedom Caucus voted no. Well, okay. So what did that mean? Because the Freedom Caucus had, 20, 30 members, whatever it had, hardcore people. That meant the most conservative people in the House, the far right people, the people who thought John Boehner was insufficiently conservative, people who think George Bush is a dangerous liberal. These people conspired to vote with the Democrats, the Pelosi's Unified Caucus. In other words, who was running the House when John Boehner was having so much trouble? A combination of right-wing people and the Democrats. Now you have the reverse. I don't know why the Republicans are given a pass on this. You telling me there aren't 30 or 40 Republicans in the House who'd like to see infrastructure? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And out of, a couple of hundred. it's been reported, and the whole narrative has been the Democrats are not unified. Pelosi and Biden have problems. I think the bigger story is that Congress no longer works, and you're just not allowed to cast votes based on principle. And the parties, this is what the two parties have done at a time in history, by the way, when they're each moving far to the left and right, respectively. So at a time when centrists should have more say because they better reflect the American people, they have less say. What's going on in the budget, let's make no mistake, is the socialist and far left people on Pelosi's left are voting identically with the Republicans. And these two groups have decided for their own purposes, they're going to thwart an agenda that polls very well, that is popular with the people, that would help the president, that would create jobs, that would provide needed infrastructure. So it's pretty disgusting, really. And I'm not saying that as a person who's yet conceding that I've lost this bet to my friend Tom Bevan. I'll feel this way even if I win the bet. This is just not the way Congress is supposed to work. And it hasn't been for 20 years.
Well, John Della Volpe, you were shaking your head.
I'm not ready to say that Congress isn't working, but I do like the analogy, I think, with the Freedom Caucus, with the Progressive Caucus, right? Which has about 100 members, is about 10% bigger than it was a handful of years ago. And it's a diverse group of members, including, I think one of the co-chairs is from Wisconsin, where I am now thinking about sausage making. I'm in Milwaukee right now taping this. But I do think that it's the beginning of a look into the next decade or so in Congress. Okay. The way I'm looking at this is you've got a progressive caucus, which has learned lessons, frankly, from the Freedom Caucus, which is representing, I would argue, not a leftist or socialist agenda, but an agenda, frankly, that is popular among mainstream American when we think about the Build Back Agenda caucus agenda, challenged by the old America, challenged by Senator Manchin in West Virginia, and he's standing up for that state's values. So you actually have the beginning, I think, of a generational struggle that we will be watching in Congress for the decade or so to come. You've got a small group, very, very, very small group of moderate conservative Democrats doing their job, standing up for their constituents against frankly, a larger group of more diverse Democrats who are standing up for their constituents. It's a battle of the ages.
Tom, you see it that way?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Sure. I mean, look, everybody, I know Carl would like everybody to, join hands and sing Kumbaya,
my Lord.
Right?
Kumbaya.
But that's not the world that we live in. It hasn't been, as Carl mentioned, for some time. And there's no question that Congress is more polarized, right? And we have, people like to blame it on gerrymandering, but it's not just gerrymandering. I mean, the Senate is not gerrymandered, but those, Republican senators have gotten more conservative, liberal senators or Democratic senators have gotten more liberal. This is a trend that's been going on in our society for the better part of 40 years. It's interesting for Bernie Sanders to say, well, 2 senators can't hold. Well, yeah, actually they can. When you've only got 50 senators, get yourself some more senators then, elect yourself some more senators. When you have a 50-50 Senate, 2 senators, 1 senator, they can hold up the entire thing. That is how the Senate works. Joe Manchin is standing up for what he believes his constituents want and what they're voting, what they voted him into office for, just like Elizabeth Warren is standing up for what she thinks her constituents want. So that is the way it works. It is not pretty. It has gotten dysfunctional. There's no question. But we are where we are. And again, I think the Democrats have put all their chips on the table to pass this huge agenda when the country is evenly divided and when their majorities are so slim. People are arguing, well, it's going to, if they pass it, it's going to cost them their majorities. And other people are arguing, well, if they don't pass it, they're going to lose their majorities anyway, certainly in the House and maybe in the Senate as well. So this is their only shot to try and get something like this through. So they're going to do whatever they can or whatever they have to. And we'll see whether it works or not. And we'll see if they, in fact, pay a political price. I think that's as yet undetermined. It will depend on what this agenda, how it manifests to the American public on a day-to-day basis. If it continues to drive inflation and people go to the polls next November and gas still costs more and food still costs more, I think Democrats are going to get thumped.
We could talk about this all day. This may be all out of date. As we say, this thing may have passed or gone down by the time we get off this podcast. But let's talk about this poll for a second. We did a poll at RealClear Opinion Research. It was on Americans' attitudes towards defense. This was done in the wake of the Afghan pullout. Carl, let me go to you first on this then. What did we learn, and what are Americans thinking about defense?
Well, the poll, and I urge people, even though we take time on this Friday podcast, but the numbers are really interesting. And John Della Volpe and his team did a terrific job going deeply into it. So I'd urge people to go to our website and find it. It ran yesterday. It's easy to find. And as always, I'll remind people our content is free. But this is interesting because at the time, you've got Afghanistan failing, the military quitting the country, the Taliban taking over before they could even get everybody out, terrorist attack killing 13 Marines and soldiers, people falling off airplanes trying to get out, just this calamity of an exit. How do people feel about the military? Pretty interesting. We gave people a choice, the support for missions and the roles of the military. And it wasn't open-ended. We listed actually 6 choices: protecting human rights, like the rights of women, children, religious, ethnic minorities was one. And they went all the way to defending Taiwan or South Korea. By the way, 3 out of 5 Americans would support Taiwan in the face of attack from China. And Korea was a little stronger. Building infrastructure, political infrastructure after a war, nation building, even that was a majority in both parties and among independents. But the highest was protecting human rights, like the rights of women, children, religious, ethnic minorities, 82%, and overwhelming, 86% Democrats, 81% Republicans, 79% independents. So there's a consensus there. The problem is, you're looking at this poll, is there's a tension between our heart and our mind, because support for leaving Afghanistan, even after this disaster, is still a majority opinion. And the mission had devolved from originally destroying al-Qaeda and making the Taliban heel, to looking for Osama bin Laden. But in the last 10 years, it has been protecting human rights, like the rights of women, children, religious, ethnic minorities. And yet Americans are tired of it. So there's a limit to our patience. We're not always willing to see it through, especially something that seemed open-ended. I'll hit a few highlights, and then we can get a conversation going on it. Young people continue to be, as we've seen in these polls, the younger voters, markedly different than their elders. If you're a young voter, you don't even remember that Taiwan used to be called Formosa. You probably never heard of Chiang Kai-shek. Defending Taiwan. Where is Taiwan, and why would we defend it? But older people who do remember this thing more solidly, and a series of things like that. Critical race theory at the military academies. Older people divided. It's not overwhelming, but slightly against, or about even. Younger people, yeah, why not? That sounds right to them. That they've gone to college, in which critical race theory is not a dirty word or a dirty phrase. The most obvious, I would say, is that young people are really foursquare against restoring the draft. Now, that's not a surprise. Young people will get drafted, so they're more against that than anyone else. So those are some of the highlights. I would say one other thing: Americans trust the military. The poll question was phrased was this: when it comes to making decisions about the U.S. military, how much do you trust the following institutions and individuals to do the right things? The rank and file, the U.S. military troops, 74%. Republicans even higher, 83%. Then military generals, well, then it starts to go down, 55%, 20% drop. The Pentagon, even lower. Then you get to Joe Biden and Donald Trump, 39%. They're underwater. Obviously, huge partisan reversal. It's just the mirror image. Democrats in Congress, chairman of the Joint Staff, Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, 34%. Barely a majority of of Democrats, by the way, only 51% of Democrats. You start to get partisan politics into it. And if you start to see the military as an extension of one party or another, support goes down. You see the military for what it's historically been in this country, nonpartisan. People still trust it very deeply. So those are some of the highlights.
John, you did the poll. What did you take away from it?
I echo Carl's insight, which is we have the most support across party lines for the missions that I would argue would be kind of considered like soft power missions, humanitarian assistance and in protecting the vulnerable. And there's clear kind of agreement with that. But once we get into the current affairs of today, that's when we see kind of the partisanship ring through. And it's really, I think, kind of a shame, right? That the military is becoming more partisan every single day. Of course, the troops, U.S. military troops, are trusted by overwhelming majorities of both parties, but that's about it. And we need to find a way to begin to talk, especially regarding our foreign policy, as I think a united nation across partisan lines. We see high levels of support among Democrats for withdrawing from Afghanistan. We saw high levels of Republicans for the same measure 2 years ago. The only difference is who was in charge. So that's where things are, I think, today regarding the military.
Tom?
I thought the numbers on trust were really interesting, and Carl referenced them. But if you dig a little deeper, 60% of Democrats trust the Pentagon, only 40% of Republicans, and 39% of independents. That's a pretty dramatic shift from where, when did that happen? The Democrats now trust the Pentagon. Democrats are also way more trusting of their own members of Congress. 2/3, 67%. And guess what? Only 55% of Republicans have trust in the Republicans in Congress for making decisions about the military. And that shows you that I think there's a legacy there regarding the last 20 years of George W. Bush, sort of interventionism, foreign policy, that is pretty stark. So I think those numbers were what jumped out at me.
I was looking at those trust numbers as well, and what struck me were the low numbers for Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who's a retired four-star general, and Joint Chief of Staff General Mark Milley, another military man, obviously. Both of them had a 34% approval rating, which put them below Donald Trump and right in line with Democrats in Congress. The only people who did worse, or only group that did worse, was congressional Republicans, who were at 31%. John, I'm wondering, when you look at those numbers, that's a distrust of military leadership. Is that what we're seeing there? Or is that tied to sort of the recent news about Afghanistan and Milley being pulled up on the Hill and all that sort of stuff?
I think there's a third factor at play, Andy, which is, a lot of Americans just don't know who they are. Don't recognize a name, don't know who they are, right? So what we're looking at, there's so many different ways to cut and slice this data. We were just looking at the top line numbers, but for Milley and for Austin, you have a quarter to a fifth of Americans just don't have enough information to have an opinion. So it's not necessarily that if you don't trust them, you distrust them. It's that, far more just don't have an opinion compared to, Democrats, Republicans, Trump, Biden, et cetera.
Isn't that to say, is that to know them is to distrust them? I mean, among the people who know who they are, 34%, only 34% trust them.
It's not among the people who know who they are, because we're including, the quarter or so within that bucket. But those people who know them as currently serving under one administration or the other administration. Even though Milley was appointed by Trump, he's now obviously a kind of a political character based upon his points of view. I think first on critical race theory and other things, and way it's being played out in the media.
Well, the other thing is, let's not beat around the bush. In Bob Woodward and Robert Costa's book, he's having ex parte conversations with Nancy Pelosi in which they're both calling President Trump, the commander-in-chief, crazy. And Milley is calling his Chinese counterpart and promising him to call him in the event of an attack on the United States military attack on China, which something Donald Trump never contemplated, as far as we know. So Milley's injected himself into the debate in a way that is going to lower his approval rating and his trust level. I think Austin's probably just collateral damage. He's caught up in that. He hasn't done anything wrong. So
the overall numbers for both of them are exact. 34 trust, 44 distrust. Okay, so he's underwater, both of them, Austin, with 22% don't know, compared to Biden, 39, 57. Trump 39-57 with only just a couple of 4% don't know. So underwater, highly politicized, I think for many of the reasons that we just talked about.
Andy, the other thing in that poll that we thought was interesting, and I'd be interested in what you think of it, is that we asked people the most formidable foreign adversary, and open-ended. They said 28% said China. There was a big partisan gap there. Republicans are 2-1 more likely to say that than Democrats. But that was the first. And then terrorist groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, then the Taliban, if you add those two together, Taliban and terrorist groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, you get about 30%. So slightly higher in China, about China. And then the rest, Russia, cyber terrorists, North Korea, Iran, other. But when John asks people, do you feel the primary threat is domestic or foreign? 58% said domestic, only 42% said foreign. So that was a striking finding as well, I thought.
Yeah. Tom, what about nation building and all this? You're not a big nation building fan. I mean, but there did seem to be support for, humanitarian missions, that sort of thing.
I think there is on a limited basis, right? When there are tsunamis and earthquakes, and the U.S. military is one of the only organizations in the world that has enough manpower and equipment to provide assistance, much needed emergency assistance. I think the American public are fine with that. Now, I'm sure there are some people who think that's not the job of the military, but I think by and large, the public supports those kinds of things.
Well, 3/4 of people in our poll said yes.
Right. So it's pretty overwhelming majority, but, that's completely different than the idea as espoused by the George W. Bush administration of spreading democracy around the globe and trying to stand up democratic governments in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and that, and spending, blood and treasure to do so. So I think that policy has been, I was going to say discredited. That might be too strong of a word, but certainly has fallen out of favor given the last 20 years of Americans' experience. So I don't think there's any question about that. Will it come back? I mean, is there, 20 years from now, will people maybe be supportive of a president who says, look, we got to invade North Korea and make it a democratic republic like South Korea? Maybe, but at least for the time being, I think people aren't going to be supportive of that, even as they are supportive of the military doing humanitarian missions and efforts around the world.
Well, let's switch to democracy here and talk about Gen Z. John, you got this new book. Highly recommend it to people. Gen Z, these are people born, I guess, around the turn of the century. You can tell us more. You paint a pretty bleak picture of the era in which they've grown up. Your title references their fear. So what are they afraid of? And given all this, why are you optimistic about their prospects?
Thanks, Andy. And why it matters first is in the next presidential election, 2024, we'll see about 40% of all votes coming from Gen Z and the millennial generation. And overall, their politics looks very, very similar. Their values, their perspective is very similar. So it is a very, very significant size kind of voting bloc. I argue in the book that this generation, I think of it as, teenagers and young people in their early to mid 20s, right? Most of the youth vote have grown up and have endured more adversity than any generation in many decades, at least, 50, if not 70 years. To give you a sense of, just a reminder of that, this is a generation, that has dealt with school shootings, an economy that makes it difficult to afford college, where there's a growing gap around inequalities. They see recession, obviously kind of COVID and the impact that is having. And we can see now obviously the political crises and questions of our democracy. So these are the public facing weights that they've been carrying. In addition to that, there's been a lot of news in the over the last several weeks about the additional stresses that social media has created. And what psychologists and psychiatrists are finding is that a majority of 18 to 29-year-olds have depressive symptoms that require medical treatments when we look at a series of metrics that folks use. So this is a highly anxious, stressed out, and depressed generation. We've seen, sadly, a doubling of the number of youth suicides of 10 to 24-year-olds. Beyond statistics, that's 7,000 families in America who lose a child. So this is an increasing amount of stress, anxiety, depression. One, not helped at all by the turmoil in our politics. That's what this generation is growing up with. But early indications are that when offered the ability to either kind of retreat or step in and fight, they're fighting, right? They're stepping up, they're organizing, they're voting, as we've talked about in this podcast before, in record numbers in 18 as well as in 20. And I argue that perhaps part of even their therapy, to feel better about their mental health, they're choosing to engage in politics to really try to solve some of the insurmountable challenges that other generations have faced, most focused on the economy, economic justice, on race, and on climate in particular.
Well, Tom, I know you've got a couple Gen Z kids in your immediate orbit. Does this all sound true to you, or what do you think?
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Having a Gen Zer in the family, I can attest to pretty much everything that John has said. Although I'm curious, though, because as we've heard, this is the most liberal generation, right, that's coming into being. I'm watching all of these football stadiums chant F Joe Biden, and I'm wondering, what is that all about? And is it really as cut and dried? Obviously, they turned out against Donald Trump, but how much of it was for Joe Biden? How much does he represent the Democratic Party? And could that potentially be something that, Republicans could make some inroads with, depending on how this next couple of years go?
It's a great question. And, when millennials voted for the first time, they were split evenly for Bush versus Gore, right? Like the rest of America, right? So back in those days, there is, we could never assume that just because you're young in a millennial that you were going to kind of vote for Democrats. In fact, Democrats took them for granted, specifically Hillary Clinton in 2016. If Joe Biden and other Democrats take them for granted in 22 and 24 and moving forward, there is plenty, I think, of flexibility available within this cohort to boost Republican chances, Tom, right? For a Democrat to win nationally, they need to get to about 60% support among 18 to 29-year-olds. Right. Hillary Clinton got to 55%. John Kerry got to 55%. So it's only a 50. That's kind of where that difference is. Now, the question is, I thought Mitt Romney could have done a better job with young people. I thought George Bush could have done even a better job with young people. The question is really, I think, up to the Republican Party. If they choose to recognize some of the fears that young people have in their overall sense of unhappiness, even with modern capitalism, if they're able to find some areas of commonality, then I think they could make some inroads. I don't think the Trump Republicans can do that, but I do think there's opportunity for a modern Republican Party, if they choose to evolve like a Baker or Hogan, to potentially make some inroads.
But wait, what about the I am curious about this F Joe Biden stuff, because my kids who are in this cohort, one of them had COVID. Okay. So he has natural immunity and does not want to take the vaccine and is feeling very put upon by all the, government mandates that are coming down on high. My other child is vaccinated, but was also, felt pretty chafed by some of the restrictions that were put in place. And I know kids that age all think they're going to live forever and they're invincible and all of those things. But how much of that, these mandates that are coming down and any continued restrictions around COVID might engender some sort of backlash against, by these Gen Zers who think, hey, listen, I'm vaccinated. Why can't I go to football games and concerts and, all the like? That to me seems like it could be a potential issue.
It could be. We know that younger people were among the least likely, right, to get vaccinated. But I also think that young people, in particular, one of the values I think they have is their concern for the most vulnerable. And I'm sure that we can choose a couple of scenes from across America, when a crowd starts to chant something and those sorts of things. But I think fundamentally, that this generation's values align pretty neatly, frankly, with Biden's values, specifically around helping the vulnerable, trying to kind of bridge the divides around the economy, offering up an opportunity to basically kind of live your best life. I talk a lot in the book in terms of what we can expect in the future, in terms of some predictions and some projections. And I think that because of the economic stress and all the other stresses around education, that young people can have a very different perspective on what it means to be happy and what it means to live the American dream. And I think that there are a lot of companies that are responding to this. I think there are a lot of elected officials who are responding to this. And we don't have to, I think the more that we listen and appreciate the very unique circumstances that, 50 to 70 million Americans are coming of age, it's going to, again, I think, be helpful for all of us moving forward, because soon enough, we'll all be working for them.
Carl, you looking forward to working for a millennial, or you think, or a Gen Zer?
Well, I have 2 millennial children and a Gen Zer, so I've actually been working for it for some time. When Bud Selig was baseball commissioner, I used to, when you give a public speech, John and Tom and I, Andy, we've all done it. You like to start out with a joke, but I would frequently say that, as long as gerrymandering wasn't the worst problem in America because Bud Selig was baseball commissioner. Well, he's long gone and people don't remember him so much anymore. But now I would say, or I would have said, till John wrote this book, which I was lucky enough to read in galleys, I would have said that the worst problem in the country, when the country started going downhill, was participation trophies, and that this ruined 2 generations of Americans, and we produced, whining snowflakes who the highest thing they could do is come up with some reason why they were victims. However, having read this book, and the book is called Fight: How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America by John Della Volpe. Having read this book, I am now more optimistic than I was before, and I would encourage all of our listeners to buy the book and read it and to give it to some baby boom curmudgeon as a Christmas present.
Are you in favor of participation trophies now, Carl? Is that?
I've moved to agnostic.
By the way, Greg, who was the one giving those participation trophies? Boomers.
Stupid baby boomers.
Did, right?
It's our
to make you feel better.
It's our fault.
Right?
No question.
Okay, boomer. Is that what it is?
That's right. All right. Well, this was a great discussion, and I wish we had more time to talk about Gen Z. I think this is a fascinating conversation. Maybe we'll come back to it later. So I look forward to diving deeper into the book. Again, it's called Fight: How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. Author John Della Volpe, our guest today. So I want to thank Tom Bevan, Carl Cannon, and John. We're usually here Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays in some form or fashion. Bookmark this podcast. Check back often. As always, I encourage you to go to Real Clear Politics, read one article from a writer or publication with whom you disagree. That may be Carl Cannon this week. Maybe Tom Bevan, who spent time with President Trump, or maybe John Della Volpe. Could be all 3. Also encourage you to subscribe to Carl Cannon's Morning Note. It's a free newsletter. It arrives in your inbox every day. You can get it by just going to RealClearPolitics.com, signing up. I can't start my day without it. You shouldn't either. Thank you for listening. Until next time, for Real Clear Politics, I'm Andrew Walworth.